So here we are in the Barracks Gallery in New Norfolk, and I'm with Victoria Ryle and Simon Spain, and we've brought to the gallery a portion, a small portion, I would say, of a fraction of your incredible joint art collection. And we're hanging it on the walls. And the purpose of this podcast interview is to talk about some of it. We haven't got a plan.
We have no plan.
We have no plan, so we're going to start at one end of the gallery and see where the journey takes us. And we've hung a portrait of your mother, Victoria, at this end of the gallery, above a little 1830s fireplace. She's looking very fine, a young woman with a stripy red knitted top.
Possibly a dress.
Possibly a dress. Tell us about your mum.
Well, I think the first thing to say is this is probably the oldest, I'm sure it's the oldest painting in our collection, but it's also the newest acquisition. On account of the fact that this painting has hung forever in my childhood homes and my mother's home until she died this February, last February, and now it's come into my possession.
And your childhood homes were where?
Moved around, well no, I grew up in West London,
Yep.
Richmond, Surrey, on the edge of London, but for 32 years this painting hung in my mother's cottage in Winsford, Somerset, in the heart of Exmoor, England's smallest national park.
Oh, so how wonderful to have it sort of here, in sort of pride of place, like it's been just a fixture throughout your life, your home.
And the only painting to have the rather traditional sort of gold frame in our collection.
Very much. Everything else is quite modern. We'll come to that, but yeah, I mean, definitely the sort of moulded gold frame. And was your childhood home full of art?
Well, you know, my parents, and I think perhaps particularly my father in later years, enjoyed buying the odd thing from people they knew, from shows, but I would not describe them as art collectors. But my mother's grandfather was a serious collector of art, and we have one or two pieces, I think, that were his, and there were also some other family portraits. They were very much of the generation where they received a certain sort of share collection of things that came down through the family, and that's what hung on the walls, that's the furniture that furnished our houses, and they didn't really think much beyond that.
Isn't it interesting? So if we go left here, we have a piece from the 1940s.
We have, I think it's actually painted in the 60s. This, because it's of my two cousins who are very similar age to me. Simon's checking if there's a year on it, but it's painted by my aunt of her children playing dominoes, and I think it's got a label on the back saying £10, and I reckon my father probably bought it off his sister when it was brand new for £10 to help his sister out, who was a typical penniless artist.
Fantastic.
And I've always been fond of it.
But a very talented artist, actually. I think she was certainly undervalued in her day.
Absolutely. She was very much overshadowed by her older brothers, and I think lacked confidence. And
who were also artists?
She was an artist.
And her brothers were as well?
Not artists at all,
No.
but they were dominant older brothers who basically, I think, gave her quite a hard time, one of them being my father. And her husband was also an artist, and so I think she was in his shadow too, although I would say she was the more talented of the two.
So how did you enjoy art as a child?
I had no aspirations to being artistic, and I was in a family that quite frankly valued the patriarchy, sport and academic prowess, and I was no good at, I was certainly not of the patriarchy and no good at sports or
They were logical
academia.
positivists, I would say.
Yes,
They were absolutely into logic, your father.
Logic was king.
Logic was king. Okay, so this is a lovely little segue, because right down here low, at sort of knee height,
Yes.
by the fireplace, we have a portrait of you.
Which doesn't resemble me.
Which does not resemble you, but...
Apologies to Michelle Ely, the painter, who is a dear friend of ours, and who rather amusingly decided to collect over some time portraits of her friends, beginning with the question for each one, are you a feminist?
Yes.
And if the answer was yes, she said, can I paint your
then
portrait?
you were in the show.
From a photo, I think, mainly. And if not, she did not paint you.
So you emerge from this patriarchal
Yes.
family as one of 50 feminists.
Yes.
Fantastic. Beautiful. Simon, shall we segue to this painting here, which is one of yours?
This is one of mine, and this came about in a period when I was revisiting my family life. My parental
dog is walking
Sorry, I thought she was going to eat the chocolate. So this painting was a time when I was revisiting my family as a source for my work, and it's what I was doing a lot of at the time, which is a combination of myself and my father. And so this is my father's head on my body, digitally transferred onto canvas, with my eyes. And there was a moment when I was working on this when I realized that my face and my father's face sort of sat across one another very easily digitally, and it was a bit of a scary moment when I dropped my father's face on my face. Oh my God, they match.
Oh my goodness.
So so that's the origin of this painting. Not much more to say about it in a way, I think.
But it does give us an opportunity to ask you about your origins and your childhood.
Origins, yeah.
Yeah.
Born south coast of England, in Brighton, and lived there, went to art college there, met Victoria there
We're coming
in
to that.
1980, and then moved to London after that. But no, south coast is my home. Two brothers, family, and my father was a bit of a character, so he does feature in my work a bit.
And was yours an art childhood?
Mine was, actually.
Yeah.
None of my family, but very influenced by my brothers, who were very, what's the word? They were interested in the arts, I'd say. They were a bit older than me, but no, probably from 15, 16 years old, I was in the art room the whole time and always doing stuff.
Was there a teacher at the school? Because you both came from houses which weren't sort of maybe hugely art houses, and both ended up at art school. So.
Yes, where did that come from? I was actually a strange story, because I was at a very traditional English grammar school.
Oh yes, so was I.
Where the Army Corps was a key part of life there. So Fridays, everyone came in with their Army Corps kit on, either Army, Navy or Air Force.
Yeah.
Unless your parents had written you a letter to say you were a conscientious objector, which my mother did for me. And of course, then what happens to all the kids who aren't in the army? They go up to the art room.
Oh, fantastic.
So I was up in the art room with our teacher, who was known as Killer because he used to throw scissors at people, but that's another story. And he was somebody, I suppose, who did inspire me, I would say, to, I don't know, I just felt it was me. Absolutely me. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move to this group of paintings and objects here, because what we can talk about here, so there's a large portrait painted by your daughter Georgia, and I know you'll tell us the story of the series that she was collecting and the objects in it, but there's also a big lino cut print of
Eugenio Montale, who's an
Italian poet, with
lamenting the loss of his wife in the Laurel. So that
Which
print, I could tell you about that print because that does link to us and our wedding when we were given £200 by, I think, your great aunt.
My great aunt, yes.
She gave us £200 and we thought, let's go and buy a piece of art with it that will stay with us. So
and
we
how
went
did you choose that? How did you choose this piece?
We went to Chelsea's College of Arts degree
graduate show.
and I don't know why we picked it.
Well, we just loved
Loved
it.
it. That's right.
I think we were quite struck also by it just because Simon's a printmaker and this is a lino cut, and Chelsea School of Art at that time had the largest lino cut press in the country.
That's right.
And I think, technically we were mightily impressed by the scale of this lino print.
It's huge.
And we have, I had it above our kind of fireplaces or in really
Prime position.
in every house we've had in London, in Ireland and in Australia, everywhere. It's been very central to us. We love the colours. I love the colours.
I love the colours. The sort of reds and purples and blues. It's it's very sort of late evening. Isn't it?
No, it's beautiful. Beautiful print.
Amazing. How did you meet?
How did we meet?
Yeah, how did you meet?
He used to hold these rather select student parties in. The only person I knew was a student who lived on his own in a flat and did not refuse to share with anyone else.
Never shared a house.
And he had what were considered rather groovy parties, and I gate crashed one.
And the rest is
gate
history?
crash, and it was love at first sight.
Was it?
Absolutely. No, Victoria brought to me. No, it's absolutely true. Victoria was for me anyway. Victoria brought to my life a level of social justice that my family and my background had never really had as a value. But it's very strong in Victoria's family, the idea of social justice. And I think as soon as we had that conversation, the fact she was training to be a teacher, it did actually seriously open kind of another way of seeing the world for me.
Well, and ditto for me, but in my case, it was, this is the life I want, the life of an artist.
Yes.
And that was a very big part of it. I thought, I've been in the wrong family all my life. A lovely family, but not
Not the right family, not your family. Yeah. Oh, how amazing. How
and
amazing.
the rest is history, yes. I mean, that was September 1980 we met. Yeah.
But
There you are. So
And the wedding for which we're relating to for the image where we bought it was 1986.
so probably that was created around that time, maybe 1985, but that sort of era. And
amazing. Now, so the link here, because we're now looking at one of George's paintings of two people, and you'll tell us who they are in a second. But the wedding picture is above them on the wall, and so it features sort of in a sort of a mirror of that, in another painting in your. And then we have two objects which also feature in this painting by
Which
Georgia.
we, yes, extraordinarily still have. This painting was painted in the late 80s when we were living in a large
sorry,
No.
stop.
Okay.
Stop.
Wait a minute.
This painting was painted about 10 years ago,
Oh, sorry.
a bit more, when our daughter Georgia
From
was,
an image from the
Yes,
late 80s.
yes.
Exactly.
Yes, okay. So you were telling
no,
me...
not from the late 80s, because our children were not born until 1991 and 1993, and the paraphernalia in this painting
I stand corrected.
is reflecting that we have young children at the time.
We I think. Yes.
So if I
Victoria,
is that it was painted about 10 years ago when our daughter Georgia was at art college at the Victorian College of the Arts, and she happened to do a series at that point reflecting on her childhood and the fact that she'd recently lost her sister.
Yep.
Our older daughter died in 2012, and Georgia was just going through old family snaps, old family photos, and very much the B ones thrown into a drawer rather than on display, and just happened to like, I think, the
sort of composition
the
here,
gestural composition of this scene with two very striking figures who were briefly in our lives. They were artists who shared, had the neighbouring studio to Simon in...
I had a studio in Columbia Road down in the East End, and Giorgio Sodotti had the next studio, and his partner Elizabeth Wright was an artist and maker as well. And...
And one of the fun things here is we've got the wedding painting, but then we've also got these two really beautiful objects here. One of which I like very much, for which we'll come to. But there's a doll in the lower right hand side of the painting, which is your childhood doll, Victoria.
It's my childhood doll from around. I think actually not when I was a small child. I got into collecting these particular dolls. I think it's around 1970, this doll, late 60s, 1970, when I was 10 or 11. But I quite like the fact that is definitely, I've dressed him in the same dress that the children had put him in in this photo. He's wearing a little dress, which I think belonged to a doll called Jill, who's long disappeared.
And he is definitely a boy.
He's definitely a boy. Yes, he's got genitalia to prove it.
Oh, really?
Yes,
there you go.
So an interesting early exploration of my children into more gender fluidity, maybe, possibly, or at least cross-dressing.
Yep. And then something I'm very excited about, and very excited about having here, because is this earthenware mug
from Wethering's
Pottery
up in Cumbria,
just near Penrith. Now this is my local pottery, and my parents collected Wethering's pottery, so I grew up eating from Wethering's plates and drinking from Wethering's mugs.
And the connection there is that this particular piece is quite a modern one from the 1980s, but when I was little, I was very familiar with, my granny had a lot of Wethering's pottery because my father and his brother and sister and mother were all evacuated during the war from Newcastle to Penrith. And they lived there for a few years, along with my father at the time was at Newcastle Grammar School, and the whole school was relocated to Penrith. And Judith, the aforementioned artist sister, simply went with them, even though her school, of course, was not relocated to Penrith, but the boys' school was, and so the family, they left Dad behind, and Mum and the three children went to Penrith. Started buying Wethering's pottery.
How interesting! How interesting. One of the things I really sort of struck by with this, because this was just in my childhood, this was just the everyday things we ate and drank out of. But this one's been broken and repaired with gold in
the Kintsugi style.
In the Kintsugi style. Yes. And for me, when I saw that, I was so sort of moved because the value of doing that to a piece of pottery, it elevated the sort of the value of these objects.
Well, I think Penrith Pottery is closed now, hasn't it?
I think it has. Yes.
I remember going back there and we thought we might go and get some more things. So I think that again made us think.
I actually worked there for a time as well. Yeah.
Well, we visited there as young adults in our 20s and bought some because I had such fond memories of my granny's collection. Sadly, I have none of her pieces now. I don't know what's happened to them because my mother would have had some. they've all gone.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've seen a few pieces in your house, which is beautiful. Okay. So let's now. You're married. Which is
Married,
great.
living in London.
And living in London. So I think the next thing to do is to talk about Scarlett and Georgia,
Yep.
who we've mentioned already.
Yep.
But they're the next big period
Okay.
of your life. We've come to the other end of the gallery, and we're at a big painting, also by Georgia, right at the other end of the gallery from where we've hung your portrait of your mum. But I think this is a really good time for us to talk about Georgia and Scarlett.
Sure.
Yeah, your two children.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, this is painted by Georgia when she was in, I think, her last or second last year of school, so when she was about 17. And at the time she painted it, Scarlett was very much alive, so it would have been probably 2011, I'd say, maybe 10. And it features the two children aged about, I think,
12
6
and 8
and
or something?
6.
Yeah.
No,
Younger.
younger
Younger,
than that. Oh, maybe 8 and 5.
Right.
8 and 5, I think. At that point, there's about 2.5 years between them, 8 and 5. And Scarlett is wearing actually aged 2-year-old Petit Bateau knickers, which I remember buying, and they just seemed to give and give and give, and she kept wearing them well beyond the age of 2. But otherwise, she's sort of just this naked figure. And there's something very sort of poignant about it, because a year or so after this, she did die in an accident, and the Georgia figure in the painting is very downcast, and somehow it took on a whole new meaning after the death of Scarlett. And although it's always been an important painting because it was an early Georgia painting that, you know, people responded very positively to, it's because it's this iconic Jesus type.
And she's facing away, there seems to be
Yes,
something odd.
yeah.
The original photograph, to link back again, like these things loop and
Yeah.
loop, was taken by the best woman at our wedding, who's a
there you are.
very good old friend,
Yeah.
Ruth Hutton, who lives in the US. And this was taken about, it's a couple of hours north of Chicago, a place called Prairie Crossing. So that was an important sort of special place for us. Now this is hung quite definitely, proudly, sort of celebrating Scarlett, really.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
At the house as well. Like sort of at your house you have this sort of the beautiful little sitting area, and this sits right.
Oh yeah,
right
that's
above
what I
the
meant.
couch.
Sorry,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
our
yeah.
house it has been very definitely loved and I think Georgia would say it's not the best painting in the world, but
Well, I mean, she was
it
very
is
young.
symbolic and it's got a lot of other power.
Yeah, and a lot of the best paintings in the world aren't the best paintings
Exactly.
in the world.
That's an interesting segue to this one.
It's a very interesting segue to this one, because obviously, I mean,
Okay,
you are able to talk about this.
Yes.
It's a massive event in your lives.
Yeah.
Anybody's life.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So which is a great segue to the Rising.
Segue to the Rising. Well, I had organised way before a residency up at Bundanon in New South Wales, which happened to
2012.
coincide 3 months after Scarlett died, and obviously we were all in complete state of grieving. But I went up there. I'd never forget driving a car full of stuff, driving up from Melbourne, where we were then living, to New South Wales, thinking, I can't do this. This is too much. 2 weeks on my own painting. This was one of the outcomes of that 2 weeks, which was an extraordinary outpouring of stuff. And I think we've acknowledged that, certainly for me, the creative act has been a means of managing grief,
Yes.
and a means of making some sense of not sense of what's happened, that's not fair, but some sense of life in a way. And this image is...
the role of art in grieving.
Yeah. This is, for me, it's quite an interesting one because of the technique I used is a technique of transferring through rubbing onto paper, but it's an image that I won't forget taking a photograph of myself just laying down naked in the old shepherd's hut at Bundanon. You know, kind of just bearing all really and being completely vulnerable.
Yeah.
And that was how I think we felt at the time. And then just found myself in this sort of odd, hopeful rising situation above the skyscrapers of Sydney. And that one hangs in our hall. It's an important kind of piece.
Very much. And when there is something sort of lifting about it, isn't there?
It brings it all back to me looking at that, that's for sure.
I'm sure. Could we sort of skip around in the gallery a bit and go to George's wedding?
George's wedding?
Yes, because I think we're talking about children, and what. So this is we've hung this right opposite the door. So it's the painting. It's a huge painting, blue background as you come in of three figures, two holding hands. And
George's wedding painting is a very interesting one because we both will tell different stories slightly, but I think we're going to elect for Victoria to tell the story.
That's a very good idea. Wise decision. Well, we got a text in the middle of the night from Georgia, who
was travelling in America at the time.
Travelling in America. Somewhere in the long break between before starting her third year back at VCA.
After Scarlett had died, obviously. After Scarlett had died.
Yes. This was would have been beginning of 2015, so 3 years after. And the text just said, "Don't freak out, but I got married on Monday." And actually, we didn't freak out because for us, news in the middle
she
of
was
the night,
alive.
Exactly right. Yeah.
had been a lot worse. And so anyway, this is the painting she did. So to cut the story short, in sort of a wonderful few weeks of solo travel here. Sorry. Where she was following in the footsteps of her musical hero, Townes Van Zandt. She had joined forces with a band who were touring Texas, and some days into this tour, they were all in Austin, and everybody was saying what a great city it was, and saying she should come and live there, and she said, "But I would need a green card." And the guy in the picture, Luke, the muso, said, "Well, I'll marry you if you can get the tops off these beer bottles." She duly did with her teeth, because they didn't have a bottle opener down by the river. And he duly agreed to marry her, and a few days later they had the celebrant lined up and they got married. And the only thing I can say is we were very shocked, and she ended up coming back to Melbourne after spending a couple of weeks in his hometown of Minneapolis when it was minus 20 degrees. And at some point it turned out that the paperwork had to be returned within a certain time period, and they both agreed that they would not.
So they didn't stay married, but
so it was a momentary thing, but there were no photos taken. So she
only record we have.
So she wrote a couple of songs, and she painted this painting to symbolise it. What I love is that that's not a literal picture of the celebrant, who was a woman, but that was one of the band holding the yellow rose of Texas. And yeah, it's a kind of iconic, very loosely styled painting, which perhaps represents a shift from the more realistic earlier work towards the journey she's been on.
It does,
since,
but I think from noticing
more.
now, walking around, that none of the work in here is sort of traditional, or not traditional, but figurative / from life. There's something about memories in these, and something about reality and how you remember things, often either through photographs or in this case through just her experience, lived experience of it. So there's something interesting. There's no sort of standard watercolour here of a landscape.
Not one single one.
They're all about constructions of memories.
And largely they're all people.
They are all figures.
Yeah, all figures.
This show is all figures, yes.
And
we love figures.
I know.
Yeah, we love people and things. It's great.
So I think what we've done is we've gone through a sort of arc of what some of these paintings mean to you as a family and a partnership, and George has now gone on to be a successful painter in her own right, and is following a career as an artist at the moment in Melbourne.
And would probably be horrified that we were showing this painting in the exhibition. She has allowed it.
No, she has given permission. Do not worry. We have sought her permission.
Yeah.
And she's generous and big enough to be quite comfortable with that.
Brilliant. So I think what this gives us an opportunity to do is come back over here and talk about sort of Ireland and Australia and your move to Australia.
Sure.
And then let's talk about your own practices.
No. We didn't bring the books up. Well, I think.
So there's a little Ned Kelly moment.
Yes.
Well, the first print here, by Carmel Benson, we acquired when we lived in Ireland. She was a well-known, and is still a well-known printmaker in Ireland.
Close to where we were living, from the Dunleary area,
South County Dublin.
And this period is after you left London. You went to Ireland, but before Scarlett and Georgia.
Oh no, they were children.
They were with you.
Okay. Georgia always thinks of her home as Ireland. Actually, she was.
Does she?
First birthday was third birthday.
Third birthday. An early birthday.
You can't count.
And we went to Ireland to work on a specific project, but then realised that probably London wasn't the place we wanted to bring the kids up, where we lived in London, in East End.
We loved Ireland, and we were very happy there, and lived there in total in Dublin, then later in Sligo.
And what was the project that you were doing?
I went to work at a place called the Ark, which was Europe's first cultural centre for children. And I went there as artist in residence, and there's a good story here that I happened to be working in Northern Ireland, and I remember driving down, like one does, to the Ark. Somebody said, you've got to go there, it's the place you'll feel at home at. I went in with one idea of what I wanted to do, and came out having had an offer of, can you do an artist residency here for, I think it was 8 weeks originally. Then, of course, I got on the phone straight away and said to Vic, it's fantastic, this place is my spiritual home, I loved an 8-week residency.
I said I had enough. I was working full-time and paying the mortgage. At this point, Simon was a freelance artist doing gigs, and I had 2 children at that point under the age of 5.
And I just spent 4 weeks in Northern Ireland.
And you've been travelling quite a bit and going to Chicago. And I said, no, I'm fed up with this. And then something happened, and I just turned around one day and I said, well, if you could make it at least 12 weeks, I'm going to give up my job and we'll all go over there.
Fantastic.
So we bumped it up to something like 16 weeks in the end, which was one of the hardest projects I've ever done. 2 school groups a day, every day. I think it was exhausting. But it was the beginning of our experience in Ireland, which was pretty special, And did several projects at the Ark. And the kids feel Ireland largely is their sort of home in a way, I think.
Yep.
And we lived in just outside Dublin, where we acquired this one for 3 years, and then we moved over to the west coast of Ireland, and we had a rather lovely house there that we'd always thought we might have artists being resident there, but that never quite worked, but ran a very successful business, which Victoria might talk about.
Well, we set up, at this point I'd given up teaching and Simon was an artist and a printmaker, but my passion was for literacy, early literacies, and children creating their own books.
Yep.
And so we set up Kids Own Publishing, which brought together our interests and our passions, and started using printmaking to print editions of books so that every child involved in the project would get to take one home. And that sounds unremarkable nowadays with the technologies we have at our disposal, but at the time it was extremely hard to get books printed. When we first started doing it, silkscreen printing was pretty well the only way.
We
because
worked
there were
together.
no photocopiers even, and the early photocopiers were only black and white.
God, we're sounding very, very old.
We are, aren't we? But it's true.
Yeah,
So we started
amazing.
working together on this in the late 1980s.
From the west coast of Ireland.
No, when we started,
London.
actually, it was in London, but we
Yeah.
set up Kids Own Publishing in Ireland. So we've been doing it for a few years on and off,
Yeah.
but I've been teaching and he'd been doing his own gigs, and then we set up.
And in 1998, in Temple Bar, which is where the Ark was, which is where I was working, we met a very interesting couple, Sue and Michael, who were from Melbourne and working there. He was there on a residency.
No,
or
she was working for an art centre there.
And we got to know them pretty well and really liked them very much. And they left a couple of years later.
Yeah.
And before they left, they said, "Oh, we're going to get you over to Melbourne, definitely."
Yeah.
And great, lovely, nice to see you, and all that. And then one day the phone went, and it was Sue saying, "Look, we've set you up with a project here, Children's Week project in Melbourne.
We're gonna
I've
work
got all the
together."
money together for you to come.
Fantastic.
Bring the family and come over and do a 3-week project." And we built a whole trip around it, but that 3-week project was pretty fundamental in us coming to Australia.
And during that first...
And what was the project?
We
called
made a
Screams
film,
and Screams.
Screams and Screens. Yes, it was a film of children, 300 children, and we made a little
It was the very
digital.
first public project to be held in Acme in
Yes,
Federation
Federation
Square.
Square.
Yeah, it was,
And
yeah.
it actually
All right.
started the week before Acme opened, and then continued the week after Acme opened, the opening
Oh,
event.
my
So we were
goodness.
the children coming into the building. What they will probably have remembered all these years later, if they remember anything, is that they were the very first children to use the toilets. No one else. It's literally taking the tape off the door and allowing these children
Toilets.
into
Well,
the
we
brand new
we could go on a very long
Let's
segue.
move on
So,
there,
because
while we were here.
arts and toilets.
Yes.
Go on.
Well, we were.
So the Ned Kelly was purchased while you
Well,
were.
this is
It was
right, next
actually
bit.
given to us. So one of the things our friends Sue and Michael had arranged for us was to go and stay a weekend with their very good friend, who is a wonderful artist, a ceramicist called Anne Ferguson, and she and her family owned this property just outside of Mansfield in the High Country, which happened also to be Ned Kelly country. And sometime during this trip, there was a lot of artwork around. She happened to give us this figure of Ned Kelly, which I think for her was B1 or
Probably.
Reject 1, possibly
Sure.
a second. I don't know. Either way, we were very glad to be given it. And
For us, it symbolised kind of
That big-
Australia.
Yeah.
And coming from Ireland, the Irish, vagabond or whatever,
Absolutely,
in high country of Victoria. But then, of course, when we put these two together now, just for this show,
Isn't it interesting?
the synergy is
Yeah, yeah,
extraordinary.
it's just
and of
amazing.
course, then we're thinking, well, that is Ned Kelly
well, it
in
obviously
the
is
picture.
Ned Kelly.
Yeah, well, it's
But
him setting off from Ireland.
Carmen Benson has obviously, channeled the Nolan series in some
Right
way.
back into Ireland.
One of the pieces we didn't bring was a tempter for next time, whatever, is a Nolan one print of Ned Kelly on one of the bridges, which we've got at home, which would have been
Which would have been amazing
trio,
with this
actually.
little group.
But they're brilliant.
Yeah, yeah.
They're an extraordinary connection, as they are, really.
Well, they really are. And so that, you then came back to Australia together after that trip.
Yes,
And
for Simon
yeah.
to work.
for Simon to work and set up art play
So
in
the
Melbourne?
segue there is when we were over for the 3 weeks, our lovely friend Sue, who said, I've organised everything for you, had also organised for me to be an advisor for the City of Melbourne on setting up a new art centre for children.
Fantastic.
And I was in an uncomfortable zone advising all of these people, I must say, on what to do. But in the end, I just sort of, on Victoria's advice...
I remember he'd had a couple of meetings, and then
this wasn't with one or two people, I must say. This was with like 15, 20 urban designers around a table. You know, it's like, right, Simon, what are we going to do?
And I said to Simon, he was getting a little bit nervous about giving them his feedback, and he'd been telling me all these things that they had forgotten and had not factored in, and saying they really don't understand what's required here on a few fronts. And so I just said, oh, for goodness sake, we're never going to see them again. Just tell them truthfully, what do you think?
I did that day, and the next day they invited me out for a coffee and said, if we advertise the job here, would you apply for this role? 4 months later, we were back there working full-time for the City of Melbourne to set the new centre up.
And it's an amazing place. Every time we went to Melbourne, we would take the kids to do something. And it didn't matter what was on. It was just always
and that really
exciting, you know?
drove our lives, my life, for 12 years, actually. City of Melbourne, that work.
Until we moved to
Tasmania. It was phenomenally successful, as far as I'm concerned. It was a wonderful time of our life. We really enjoyed being in Melbourne.
Right by the Yarra, like an amazing location.
A fantastic location, but of course a couple of years before I left, that's when Scarlett had died, and that's when it really became very difficult to kind of hold down a job in a sense, in that way. You know, priorities in life have changed.
We're standing in front of a print.
A drawing.
A drawing.
An ink drawing.
Ink drawing.
A one-off, yes.
Tell us about this one.
Simon Dratmo was one of the many artists we had visiting when we were running Art Play. We had artists from all over the place. He came over from Indonesia. He did a residency with us, and he came and stayed, or was in our house for a while. This was one of many drawings he made, and he gave it to us when he left.
It was very soon after the Yogyakarta earthquake.
Yeah, or as it says on here, the earthquake, which is quite funny. We have the same son. I think it's an interesting one. It's a beautiful figure and very different to the others. I think that's why we put it in. In a way, it symbolises the nature of working with other artists. That we've always kind of done that, and he was somebody at Art Play that it's just lovely to interact and engage with different artists.
A powerful image of the force and power of the world, the earth, which seems to be symbolised by these fingers coming out of the earth, which is the earthquake. But also I always think that figure there is like a big colonial boot standing
So
which may or may not be what he intended, but to me it says something about, you know, where has the world gone wrong?
I think it was. I think it is something about just having different views of the world, isn't it, by artists?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's probably a good time, Victoria, if we go to our right, there's two figures.
Two figures, both created by Auntie Vera, who was the elder Vera Cameron, that I worked with on a project up in Arnhem Land, in the Northern Territory, as part of the work of Kids Own Publishing, which...
So Kids Own Publishing carried on?
Kids Own Publishing had a new lease of life in Australia.
Yeah.
It's actually was set up as a sister company, quite separately to the one in Ireland. Both are continuing. The one in Ireland has now reached 25 years, and this year the one in Melbourne 20 years.
We spoke at the 25-year thing, didn't we? We launched their event.
And both are flourishing without my presence. I'm no longer part directly of either, but a huge fan of the work they do.
Isn't that really wonderful when the work that you do just sort of carries on beyond you? You'd actually,
And just incredible work to honour the voices of children and open up avenues for telling their stories through published books.
And this
So,
was
so
with an
tell us about
indigenous
this project, because
So these
because
are,
there are books that go with these, which we may end up bringing up for part of the exhibition.
There is a book called Too Much Bats,
Yeah.
which I hope we will add into the exhibition. And Auntie Vera was our elder who advised and told the original stories to children that allowed the children to then respond with their own story, which is captured in the book. And these are Mukai figures, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, that I think are a form of Mimi spirit. So they're good spirits.
Yep.
And so this is her own artwork. And the project that we did in Beswick or Woogala community, east of Catherine, was through the local arts centre.
Can't remember what it's called either.
Gilpin Arts Centre. And Auntie Vera was one of the leading artists, and her work was sold through the gallery. And we bought these.
Yeah, they're
They're
beautiful.
very strong. I mean, I'm just looking at them now, really fresh, you know, and I think the paler one is such a strong figure. I think that's what kind of draws us to them, isn't it? That they're just very powerful images.
And I have really very special memories of the older women taking me and the other artists with me out into the bush, and we would go and collect the sugar bag and find the pandana sleeves for their weaving, and then generously showing us their technique for dyeing the pandanas and for weaving.
So are these pandanas? I assume they
It'll
were.
be pandanas,
Yeah.
yes,
Oh,
for
yeah.
sure.
Yep.
And I remember being horrified that there was some buffalo around, and they were very worried about the buffalo coming too close. And at one point they just set fire to this tree to scare off the buffalo and left this tree just burning. Just burning in the bush. Well, they went about their business and the buffalo scarpered, and I was terrified we were going to start a big fire. They were not worried.
We've got a fair few sort of indigenous artworks, but the majority of paintings, of course, are not directly figurative in our sense of the word. So that's why I think.
So that's why these have come to the exhibition.
They offer an indigenous kind of figurativeness, if you want.
But such a great sort of connection to the work that you do.
Oh, absolutely.
And
you know.
And kind of the work that both of you do as artists, which is very collaborative and participatory. Yeah, so it's not I know there is some solo practice in there, but there's also so much that's about drawing people in and bringing people together. Community engagement. So maybe we could talk about these two
pretty well. I think that was something I really
figures.
identified in doing a PhD. I did mine around this work in a way. Vic's doing hers now about books. Around that public participatory practice. So it's where an artist brings an idea or a concept to whole groups of people who can enact something very creative. Every time it's different, but they can come together. And these two figures were a main part of a work I did called Self-Assembly, which is made of 7 pieces of wood from the land that had fallen, sawn up, and covered in plaster bandages, the sort you would repair a broken arm with. And I remember this was obviously in the period post Scarlett's death, and somebody said to me at one point, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? They're all you being repaired. So it's scary, but the lovely thing about this work is the people make a figure each, and then they bring them together, and they have to find a moment of balance and connection. When they join the hands together with a piece of bandage, it only takes a few minutes to set, and then they can step back, and you get this wonderful kind of free-flowing figure here that happens. So these are just 2 from multiple groups of these done around the world, basically. We've done this project.
And these 2 from the Tate project?
These were not. These were ones I think done back in the studio in the very early days.
Yeah.
They were some of the very first ones back in 2017, I think this was, yeah.
And that's such a nice thing, isn't it? That because neither of these figures could stand up on their own.
No.
They're just
You have to have somebody.
sticks standing on the ground.
Yeah.
Sort of, so they have to create a standing.
It is. I mean,
sculpture.
all the work that we've done with the books and everything is all around achieving something. Everybody who contributes feels they've really made something individual, powerful, but
That
can
comes
sit there with
together.
part of something else, and it's a wonderful way of being, really, to be able to do that. So,
Yeah. And aren't they
And
sort of
amazing
striking?
how expressive wood can be.
I know. Look at this
Very
little
simple.
character here with this,
Well,
with this
yeah.
sort of
they
smiling
wouldn't be
face.
otherwise. You
Yeah.
see, if you just sent out 7 pieces of doweling or something to people, you wouldn't get anything so free-flowing and rich.
No.
It's the fact that you're working with the natural forms that just seem to echo the body, or perhaps the body echoes the forms. It's one of my favourite pieces. Hopefully, might be doing this again next year, I'm hoping, in Tasmania. So,
Hope so too.
see.
So can we talk about, is this more of your solo practice?
Yeah,
maybe?
it is. I suppose this again was part of the PhD, and I think there's not a lot to say about this, but it was part of a big body of work around portraiture of mostly myself, but nearly all figures. And I suppose the thing to say here about the link is how funny I'm now reflecting that I put my face on my father's face, in the previous image, and here I put it on the top of the figure which is standing in front, which is a ceramic bowls bottle, and there is the figure up in the image. So there's sort of, I don't know, and that figure I bought, I think before I met Victoria. I think I earned that from about 1979
What
at art
drew,
college.
that's so interesting.
I don't know
drew
what
you
it
to
is.
it?
I just think it's a beautiful thing.
Yep.
It's a beautiful figure. And the figures, the black figures, are part of a series I made at RMIT of pilgrims. It was a very short-term project, but it was about reusing materials. And I just actually do just love them. I think they're really, they did something for me. And of course the face on the top is me, but
Yes.
it's echoed back in the image behind, reversed of the same face. So there's a kind of circularity around the way I work about recycling images and things that just constantly are part of an ongoing practice.
And these figures we could have easily placed them with the Ned Kellys.
We could.
They're sort of
Yeah, they
armoured and
They are.
Yeah.
It's something really interesting about all of this, isn't there? About
Yeah,
the length of time we hold on to objects.
it's so
I mean, that
interesting.
figure
Yeah.
I've held on to, and these things will go to Georgia. There's the doll that you've held on to. These things, why have I held on to that figure? I don't know. I love it. As simple as that.
Can we finish with just talking about the fundraising piece and we should also mention
Perhaps we
your
should do
friend's
that one first.
portrait. So tell us about this, which is sort of
Well, I think the link actually is that the very complex drawing of a city within a head is by a very good friend of ours, artist Phil Fawkes, who is the partner of Michelle Ely, who painted my portrait back at the other end of the gallery.
And great friends in Melbourne.
And they were actually responsible for helping us arrange a project that we did in a few years after our daughter's death as a fundraiser, which the series is called just Scarlett's Prints, and a number of artists very generously donated a print that we used to raise funds for Scarlett's Fund, which has supported a number of projects in the space of arts, young people, and social justice. And this particular one,
Icarus and Narcissus.
By John Ryle in 2016, and it was triggered, and basically we gave the artist a poem, And
we gave the answers a poem and a square piece of liner.
And a square piece of liner,
and we
and
said,
asked them to
come
respond.
back to us with something.
And
the poem we gave them.
The poem we gave them was by W.H. Auden, Musée des Beaux-Arts, and I'll just give you the beginning of it.
Victoria often will remember this, but
I'm going to read it because I don't trust my memory, but I do know it, and I've recited it many times. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position. How it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window, or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course anyhow in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life, and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get on to and sailed calmly on. One word then.
And we chose that poem because...
Well, it was actually one that Scarlett introduced me to, and she absolutely loved. They did a whole unit on W.H. Auden's poetry, and I remember, several of them, Stop All the Clocks was very familiar to me, but not that one.
And
since
it
then,
gave
it's
the
been
artists
a
broad range of possibilities of what to illustrate.
It did. But the other connection is that after Scarlett died, and I had... you have nowhere to put all these feelings you have inside. And I used to take our dogs for a walk, and I'd literally have a little scrap of paper with a poem or a few lines of a poem in my pocket, and I would recite it over and over and over until I remembered it out loud, somewhere a long way from other people, hopefully. And sometimes I'd be shouting it, or I'd be kind of, getting the rhythm and the beat going. And I think it was just a way of releasing some of the adrenaline that builds up at that point of, I suppose, powerful, overwhelming grief.
And we haven't really covered why and when we came to Tasmania, but actually we came in as a response to that loss. To how many years after?
About 4 years afterwards.
Yeah, and we came to
4.5 years.
What's the word? Be enriched and be by the landscape and the rhythms of the place, really. And it's done quite well.
3.5 years afterwards.
I think one of the other, can I say something else now? Something else about the stuff on the wall. Isn't it interesting how thickly embedded in there are stories?
Oh, isn't it amazing?
I mean, never go and buy a piece of art off an IKEA wall. IKEA to put on your wall. Every one of these has got something in.
Yeah.
And not just one thing.
Like you said, it doesn't matter how good the painting is.
And that is at the heart of a collection.
Isn't it?
It's all the stories woven together and how those reinforce, your own sense of relationship and journey through life.
Oh my God.
And one of the things I love so much about what you've brought together here is it's very much a joint collection.
Totally.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that he's the artist and I am not.
Well,
I'm an arts educator.
Yeah, but it's joint stories and it's a partnership through life, and that's come through so.
It's about feeling,
clearly.
though. I think we feel things through this work. Everything has an emotional connection.
Yeah.
Every single thing in here has a very powerful emotional connection.
Yeah. So Victoria, Simon, thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you for talking today, for sharing the stories, and for letting us see the work on the walls. It's such a treat and such a privilege.
It's been a treat
Thank
to
you
see
so
it,
much.
so thanks for inviting us.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's certainly a privilege for us to be given this opportunity. Thank you.